The room was full of people who had never once been told they didn't belong anywhere. That's the first thing you need to understand about what happened that morning at the Meridian Group's annual strategy summit in downtown Toronto. The kind of room where everyone had a badge that cost more than some people's monthly rent, where the coffee was fair trade Ethiopian and the chairs were ergonomic and imported, and every single person seated at that long glass table had a LinkedIn profile that read like a monument to themselves. And then there was Nkechi Darling. She had taken the 6:47 bus from Scarborough, not because she couldn't afford a taxi, though honestly, that morning she couldn't, but because the bus ran on time, and Nkechi had learned a long time ago, in a place very different from a glass boardroom in downtown Toronto, that you do not miss your window. You get there. You do the job. You go home. That's it. She was 29 years old. She had spent 4 years with the Canadian Forces. 2 of them on rotation in a place she still wasn't allowed to talk about in anything other than vague terms at dinner parties. Not that she got many dinner party invitations these days. She had a degree in economics from Ryerson that she'd finished online during her last deployment, 1 course at a time between shifts and briefings, and the particular kind of silence that exists only in the hours before dawn when you're a long way from home and you still have to show up sharp. She was not on the official attendee list for the Meridian Group Summit. Let that sit for a moment. She had been hired 6 weeks earlier as a contract analyst through a staffing agency, the kind of position that comes with a temporary badge and a desk near the photocopier, and the unspoken understanding that you do not speak unless spoken to, and even then you keep it brief. She was there to run numbers, compile slides, and hand things to people who would then present those things as if the numbers had grown organically from their own considerable minds. She knew this. She had accepted it. For now. The man at the head of the table was named Clifton Ashby, and if you have never encountered a Clifton Ashby in your professional life, consider yourself fortunate, because Clifton Ashby was the kind of person who had mistaken access for intelligence so many times over so many years that the distinction had simply ceased to exist for him. He was 54 years old. He had gone to Upper Canada College, then Western, then had done an MBA at Rotman, and he had been telling people about all 3 of those things, in that order, for the better part of 3 decades. He was the chief strategy officer of the Meridian Group, which managed private equity interests across 6 provinces, and he had the handshake of a man who wanted you to know exactly how much he worked out. He also had, as Nkechi had discovered in her 6 weeks of compiling slides and running numbers, a fundamental misunderstanding of how risk modeling worked. Not a small misunderstanding, not a rounding error or a difference of methodology. A structural, load-bearing, the whole thing collapses if you pull this thread kind of misunderstanding. The kind that had probably been nodded through a dozen times by people who understood it perfectly well, but had decided that explaining it to Clifton Ashby wasn't worth the particular variety of Tuesday afternoon it would cost them. Nkechi had spent 2 evenings catching it. She had sat at her kitchen table in Scarborough with a cup of tea going cold and gone through the model 3 times, and each time she arrived at the same place, the projection that Clifton Ashby was about to present to this room of ergonomic chairs and fair trade coffee as the foundation of a $200 million reallocation strategy was built on an assumption that would not hold. She had written it up, cleanly, precisely, with annotations and a corrected model attached. She had sent it to her supervisor at the agency, a pleasant man named Gerald, something who wore the same 3 blazers in rotation and always seemed faintly apologetic about everything. Gerald had replied the following morning. His email was 4 lines long. The first line thanked her for her diligence. The second line noted that Mr. Ashby had considerable experience in this area. The third line suggested that she focus on her assigned deliverables. The fourth line was a reminder about the summit's dress code. She had read that email twice. Then she had closed her laptop and gone for a run. 12 kilometers, at a pace that would have surprised most people who looked at her. Running was the thing she had brought back from the forces more intact than anything else. That particular understanding of what your body can do when your mind stops negotiating with it. When she got home, she showered, put on the one blazer she owned that was appropriate for a room like this, and took the 6:47 bus. The summit began at 9. Clifton Ashby took the floor at 9:45 after 2 other presentations that Nkechi had helped build and that were, as far as she could tell, structurally sound. He walked to the front of the room with the ease of a man who has spent his entire adult life being the most comfortable person in any given space. He thanked the room. He made a joke. The room laughed. He clicked to the first slide. Nkechi was sitting along the side wall at a smaller table with the other support staff. She had her laptop open. She had her corrected model open on a second window. She sat very still. You have to understand something about the particular discipline required in that moment. This was not a military operation. No one was at risk. It was a boardroom in Toronto, and the worst thing that would happen, in any concrete immediate sense, was that some very wealthy people would make a decision based on flawed data. The world would not end. The sky would not fall. But Nkechi had learned, in the particular school she'd attended, that errors have a way of compounding. That the thing you let pass in the morning is the thing you're dealing with at midnight. That the small decision to say nothing is almost never actually small. And there was something else. Something she hadn't let herself think about too directly until this moment, sitting along the side wall in her one good blazer, watching Clifton Ashby click through to the slide she had built. She had sat in briefings where getting the numbers wrong had real consequences for real people. She had seen what happened when the assessment was off and the decision was made anyway. She had watched that play out. She was not interested in watching it play out again, even in a smaller key, even in a room where the only casualties would be measured in basis points. Clifton Ashby reached the core slide, the projection, the $200 million rationale. He said, "What you're looking at here is 18 months of modeling. This took my team the better part of a year and a half to get right. Every assumption has been stress tested. Every variable has been validated." He let that land. "This," he said, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has confused the length of a process with the quality of its output, "is as solid as it gets." Someone at the far end of the table was nodding. Several people were writing things down. The room had the ambient hum of consensus building in real time, that collective lean-in that happens when a confident person says a confident thing in a confident room. Nkechi looked at the slide. Then she looked at her screen. Then she looked at the slide again. She raised her hand. This, in itself, was not ordinary. The people along the sidewall did not raise their hands. That was simply not a thing that happened. One of the other support staff, a young man named Perry, who had been there 8 months and had clearly learned the customs, actually turned to look at her with an expression that was equal parts alarm, and something that might have been, in other circumstances, admiration. Clifton Ashby did not see her hand at first. He was already moving to the next slide. "Excuse me," Nkechi said. Her voice was not loud. She had spent years learning to make herself heard without raising her volume. The kind of skill that comes from having to deliver information clearly under conditions where raising your voice was sometimes the worst possible option. The room heard her. Clifton Ashby heard her. He turned. He looked at her the way certain people look at a sound they cannot immediately categorize. "Yes," he said. "I think there may be an issue with the volatility adjustment on slide 14, Nkechi said. The correlation coefficient in the base assumption. I believe it's been applied to nominal values rather than real values. It would affect the projection by approximately 12 to 17% in the downside scenario." Complete silence. Not the silence of a room that hasn't heard something. The silence of a room that has heard something and is waiting to understand what it means. Clifton Ashby looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked around the room, briefly, in the way that powerful people sometimes do when they need to quickly re-establish the geography of a space. Then he looked back at her. "And you are?" he said. "Nkechi Darling, contract analyst." "Contract analyst," he repeated, slowly, with a particular weight on each word, as if he was turning them over to examine the underside. "And this model, the model that my team spent 18 months developing, you've identified an error in the, what did you say, the volatility adjustment, the correlation coefficient," she said. "Yes, based on," he said. "What exactly?" "Based on the model," Nkechi said. "I can walk through it if that would be helpful." Someone at the far end of the table, a woman named Frances, Nkechi would later learn, who ran fixed income for the Western portfolio and had a very good poker face, made a sound that was not quite a cough and not quite a laugh, but lived somewhere between the two. Clifton Ashby set down his clicker. He looked at Nkechi the way people look at things they intend to deal with efficiently. He said, "This model has been reviewed by 3 senior analysts and externally validated by Devereaux Partners. I don't think a contract analyst with," he paused, taking her in, all of her, the blazer, the temporary badge, the seat at the side table, with limited visibility into the full scope of this project is in a position to. "I can show you," Nkechi said. She had already pulled up the corrected model. She turned her laptop screen outward. She said, "If you look at the base case inputs on tab 3, the nominal GDP growth rate is being used as the deflator for the real return assumption. That's the assumption that flows into the correlation coefficient. If you apply it to the real series instead, the output shifts by," she looked at her screen, 16.3% in the downside, which moves the expected return from 8.2 to 6.9 under stress conditions, which is below the hurdle rate. Silence again. A different kind of silence this time. Frances, at the far end of the table, was no longer maintaining her poker face. She was leaning forward, slightly, in the way that people lean when their body has already understood something their mind is still catching up to. A younger man near the middle of the table, one of the senior analysts, Nkechi had seen him in the hall, had his own laptop open now. His fingers were moving. Clifton Ashby said, with tremendous precision, "That is not what the model shows." "I know," Nkechi said. "That's what I'm saying." 20 seconds passed. 25. The young analyst near the middle had gone very still, staring at his screen. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "She's right." He said it again, louder. "She's right. The nominal real confusion, it's in the base inputs. It propagates through." The room shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, more like a large ship beginning to come around. You feel it before you see it. Frances said, almost to herself. "Devereaux signed off on this. Devereaux validated the methodology," the young analyst said. "If the input assumption was wrong before they received it, then they validated a methodology applied to a flawed premise." Frances finished. Clifton Ashby was very still. He had the look of a man experiencing a private weather event that he had not yet decided how to present publicly. He turned to Nkechi. He said, with enormous care, "How long did this take you?" Nkechi considered the question, to find it or to correct it. "Either." "About an evening," she said. "Finding it took maybe an hour. Correcting it and documenting it took the rest of the night." He looked at her for a very long time. Here is the thing about Clifton Ashby that Nkechi had not known before that morning, and that she would come to understand better over the weeks and months that followed. He was not, at his core, a stupid man. He was a man who had been insulated from the consequences of his assumptions for so long that he had stopped examining them. There is a difference. It does not make him a hero, but it matters, he said. "Can you walk us through the correction?" And Nkechi Darling, contract analyst, temporary badge, seat at the side table, pulled her chair to the front of the room, and walked a table full of senior executives through 18 months of modeling that they were going to have to redo. She did it clearly. She did it without drama. She answered questions as they came, and when someone pushed back on a specific assumption, she explained her reasoning, and, in 2 cases, updated her own numbers when the pushback was valid. She had spent enough time in environments where being wrong and admitting it quickly was simply the professional thing to do. She was not attached to her version. She was attached to the right answer. It took 45 minutes. When it was done, the room was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The kind of quiet that follows something that cannot be unfollowed. Frances asked how Nkechi had ended up in a contract role. Nkechi said, briefly, that she'd transitioned out of the Canadian Forces about a year earlier and was building her profile in the private sector. Frances said, "What branch?" Nkechi said what she was able to say, which was not much, but was apparently enough, because Frances made a small sound of recognition and wrote something down. Clifton Ashby did not say very much for the remainder of the summit. He had the look of a man who was rearranging a great many things internally, and preferred to do this in private. He was not gracious, exactly. It's in the way that people sometimes are in movies, when they are faced with their own error, and discover a previously hidden nobility of character. He was simply quiet, and in its own way, the quiet was more honest than the graciousness would have been. At the end of the day, as people were gathering their things and the catering staff were clearing the coffee service that had been replenished twice, he walked to where Nkechi was packing up her laptop. He stopped. He said, without looking at her directly, "Good catch." 2 words. Nkechi would think about those 2 words later, on the bus home, the 5:23 from Union, packed with people going back to wherever they came from, all of them carrying whatever they'd accumulated over the course of the day. 2 words from a man who had spent the last 8 hours coming to terms with the fact that he'd been about to stake $200 million on a premise a contract analyst had caught in an evening. 2 words were not an apology. They were not an acknowledgement of anything larger than the immediate operational fact. But they were, she had to admit, something. She got home at 6:47. She changed out of her blazer. She made rice and fried plantain, the way her mother had made it, the way her mother had made it, which was the way her grandmother had made it, and she ate standing at the kitchen counter because she was tired and also because she had been eating standing up at counters since she was a teenager, and it had never struck her as a problem. She called her younger brother, who was 17 and doing his grade 12 year, and who asked her how her day was in the tone of someone who was asking because they had been told to. She told him it was fine. It was good, actually. She'd had a thing happen at work that worked out all right. He said, "Cool," and told her about a test he had coming up in chemistry that he was nervous about. She told him to call her this weekend, and they'd go through it together. She had taken chemistry. She had taken a lot of things, in a lot of different conditions, and she had found that almost everything, when you broke it down to its actual components and looked at what was actually there, was more manageable than it appeared from the outside. That was perhaps the most important thing she had learned. Not in school, not in the forces, though both had reinforced it, but somewhere earlier, in a life that had asked her to figure certain things out on her own and had not always given her ideal conditions for doing so. The truth does not care how long you've been doing something. It does not care about your title or your track record or the name of the school on your wall. It does not care about the confidence with which you present it, or the quality of the chairs in the room where you present it, or whether the coffee is fair trade. It just sits there, waiting to be found. Nkechi had found it, and then she had shown it to the room, and then she had taken the bus home. 3 weeks later, Frances called. Not Gerald from the agency, not the Meridian Group's HR. Frances directly on a Tuesday afternoon when Nkechi was at her desk near the photocopier running pivot tables. The call was brief and practical. There was a position opening at the end of the quarter, fixed income analytics, with a rotation into strategy. It was not a contract role. It was a permanent position with the kind of number attached to it that Nkechi had to sit with for a moment after the call ended, before she let herself fully register what it meant. She looked at her temporary badge. She looked at the photocopier. She looked at the pivot table she had been running. She saved the file, closed the laptop, went to the window at the end of the hall that looked out over the city. The same city she had grown up in, had left, had come back to with a degree finished online, and 4 years she wasn't entirely able to talk about, and a very specific understanding of how to find the thing that someone else has decided isn't worth looking for. The city was doing what the city does. Moving, being itself, unaware, as cities tend to be, of the particular moments happening inside of it at any given time. Nkechi stood there for a minute, maybe 2. Then she went back to her desk. She still had work to finish.